when you're starting to make all these connections, do you get to a point where like you're almost dizzy, or you feel like you get schizophrenic at a certain point? You're like, because you can start to make connections all over the place, and you have to like kind of like restrain yourself, you know. Do you feel that way often? Because you start to pile up all this stuff, and maybe I'm just projecting, and you're like, it does feel like the more you learn, it does become smaller to a degree, and it's like it's all really kind of connected. That's where I've been lately. You know, no matter how deep into the past you go, or right now, it seems to just be a small network of evil that transcends just like any type of people or government.
I think there's a process that we all go through as we learn this stuff. I mean, when you first learn this, a lot of it's shocking and it can be scary, and you can kind of have a dark phase, and then you kind of you process it and grieve. And a lot of people have compared it to like a death of a relative, where you know you go through these stages of grief or whatever, and then you kind of are fine with it. You've accepted it. That's how it is. And I would say too, in terms of intellectual maturation and journey, like. Yeah, I mean, in my 20s and in the 2000s, when I was really first getting into a lot of this stuff, I would say a lot of my analysis is probably immature. Even some of the essays I wrote in Esoteric Hollywood 1, I mean, I wrote those probably around 2008, 9, 10, 11. So even some of those, I think, are a little immature now looking back. I think the substance of the book holds up. I'm not like dissatisfied overall with it. But I think what happens is that you get a little more sophisticated and mature in your analysis. You learn where you've made mistakes. You know, like, for example, back then I was probably, I gave a little more credence to numerology back then than I would now. I kind of think a lot of that's just baloney. Right. But, you know, I think in your 20s, you're just not as, which is when I wrote a lot of those. I think you're not as mature and sophisticated. So you don't have the practical experience of seeing that a lot of that stuff doesn't pan out. That's a lot of baloney.
When you were
and you got to make mistakes, you know what I mean? Like I'm sure in your journey, we all like, I watched this video on Tartaria, and it's like, now I've figured out ancient history. And then you're like, no, you probably didn't. Right. You know what I mean? But I don't have a problem being skeptical about like civilizations or,
of course,
you know,
I think it's good
stories.
It's good to learn to be skeptical of your skepticism.
There you go.
That's a thing I've been thinking about a lot too, because I'm skeptical of a lot of things. Did you have religion in your life when you were in college?
Yeah. I mean, so throughout my 20s, I was working full time, so I had I only took classes part-time, and that's why it took me like 8 or 10 years to finish undergrad. It took me forever to finish my undergrad. But because I was working full-time. So most of that time, yes, if I recall, I was pretty much I began my 20s as a Protestant Calvinist, and then I quickly converted to Catholicism in around 2001 or 2. Maybe 2003 or somewhere in there. And then, so most of my 20s and the 2000s, I was Catholic, trad cat. Started doubting that by about 2008, 9.
I asked
that whole period I was in college. That was my undergrad period.
Yeah, I'm curious just because college, as I experienced it as a student, as a professor, has become a very godless place. And it seemed like you had a fairly good experience. And I had a decent experience too. I did not have religion in college. And it seems like people who go to college to go to these godless places, who have some type of moral center, can survive. And even having a leftist professor who is more open-minded, you know, I did not see a lot of that by the time I was out of the college world. And I didn't see a lot of students who had college. And I actually, at one point, taught at a Catholic school, but that Catholic school was not very...
Might as well have been secular.
100%. Yeah, it was crazy. You know, they were hosting all the crazy, you know, stuff that you would not expect to be there.
My college experience was okay. I mean, there was some negative parts. Particularly the grad school was actually the worst part. Undergrad was a lot of fun. And because I took so long to do my undergrad, I actually cycled through multiple professors because I was almost always for that 8 or 10 year period, like I was in English and philosophy department the whole time. So I'd actually see multiple professors and people, even heads of the department, come and go. And overall, I mean, I had maybe 1 or 2 professors that I just really couldn't stand, didn't get along with. But overall, it was okay. I mean, I was like working, so I wasn't really partying all the time. I didn't have like a wild, college time. All my wild stuff had happened when I was in high school. I got all that out like my high school period. So
yeah, same.
When I got to college, I was pretty much focused on the ideas. I was really entranced with learning philosophy, learning lit. I really wasn't into, fooling around anymore.
Did you feel like pushback against, or did you share religion in school at all with the professors that had come up in the philosophy class?
I was in the philosophy debate club. Like,
oh, nice. I'm not surprised.
My sophomore year, I did a debate with professor. Like, I was debating nonstop. So yeah.
So that's where this comes from. That's where I wanted to get to this, is like one of the first things I saw from you, however long ago it was I see you online somewhere being like, just come debate me. I'm like, this is interesting. What's this about? And it just seems, I like this thing that you do. And I see it often where you're just asking people to debate religion. I think that's extremely important. And it's rare that debates happen and they happen well. I don't know what your experience is with all the debates that you've done so far, but I guess first I'm very curious. You said you started off Calvinist to Catholic to I believe you're Orthodox Christian now. Yeah. How did that arc go? Like, what were you reading? Was it stuff you were reading, experiences you had that led you to this?
Yeah, I mean, just to make that kind of a long story short, I was raised Baptist. Didn't go to church or care at all really in high school about any of that. I was just super wild dude. And then my senior year of high school, I started going to Bible studies, getting back into going to various churches. Then I think when people go to churches and they start, asking questions about it, they kind of naturally, there's a progression that happens where we start asking questions like, okay, well, I'm Baptist, but why? And where does this come from? And what's the history of the church? And so the more that you dive into church history, I think you move kind of away from Protestantism. And so I kind of did that. And this was like, again, remember in 2001, 2, 3, there wasn't as much stuff online.
Right.
So I was having to work through a lot of stuff just purely with books. And there weren't a whole lot of online resources back then. But I remember thinking, okay, so, what's the history of the Bible? Like, where does it come from? Who put it together? And that led me to really getting deep into church history, reading the church fathers, buying that big church volume, their 38 volume church fathers set. I had this weird situation where I worked at a place that was a paint store to where like most of the downtime during the day I could read. So literally for like 10 years, I worked at a paint store. I just sat there and read all day.
Perfect.
Because you would have contractors coming in the morning.
Yep.
They come in at like 4:30, you close at 5. So there's basically like the 6-hour window where you can just read all day.
Incredible.
So I got a lot of reading done during that decade of the 2000s. And I remember just kind of reading my way through Protestant into Catholic stuff. Mm-hmm. After a while, Catholicism really just left me unsatisfied with particularly the issues of changes between pre-Vatican II and post-Vatican II Catholicism. So that set me on another pathway of, I didn't become an atheist, but I had a period where I was kind of like reading perennialists and reading Neoplatonists and reading all kinds of different stuff. And I was really just dissatisfied with Rome. I almost became Orthodox in 2007 because I was dating a girl and we started going to Orthodox church at the time. We ended up not going that route. We were going to get married. We decided not to. And so I held off on becoming Orthodox, and I just kind of like was in this amorphous place for about another 10 years. And then I ended up deciding to eventually become Orthodox in 2016, 17.
Yeah. Was there something, that just clicked all of a sudden that you can even explain, or just felt like it was time?
No, it wasn't like one thing. It was just like a lot of reading, a lot of processing, a lot of, it wasn't all just abstract stuff. Like, I was, visiting various churches, and I had a lot of friends that were atheists, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant. And, ever since college, like I've been debating.
Right.
Just all the time. Like we used to go, when I was 18, we would just like go around to coffee shops and just debate random people. We would go to the campus before I was even at college and just debate random people. Just kind of crazy. Why? That's just what we did. I don't know. Thinking back, I guess it's kind of crazy spurgy, but
I think it's good.
So there was just always various like crews and circles of people that I knew where we're always exchanging these ideas. So there wasn't really like one thing that clicked. It was just like a bunch of things.
It seems like you debating has helped grow, I believe, the immune system of your own beliefs. Am I wrong?
I do think it has that capability. It can also be an idol. You can make it into like, it could be also a thing where you obsessively always question your beliefs too. So it could work to undermine your beliefs, but I think you're right. Like iron sharpens iron. So eventually,
do you hear the same argument against?
Exactly. That's what I was going to say next.
Yeah. That I can imagine gets tiring. But like, what are those arguments? Is it against specifically your type of church? Is it, just against just God in general, against Christ? What do you cycle through from the people who are arguing it?
Well, one thing we've done is I didn't really know a lot about Islam like 7 or 8 years ago. So actually, through some random events that happened, I don't think this wasn't like planned or anything, but people started saying, hey, why don't you debate this Muslim dude? And this kind of like tripped off this whole other pathway of a domain that I didn't know anything about. I never really debated Muslims until 2018. I think we had the first Muslim debate. And that kind of set this new domain and arena up for me to kind of dive into. So it doesn't get monotonous when you kind of have these new topics to discuss. But like, say, atheist materialist. I mean, I've never heard an atheist materialist offer an argument different than anything I heard in college when I was 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. Like, it's the same. So that one gets really old. I've had that debate hundreds of times. I've never heard anything new. The only thing that could be new is I think sometimes if you debate like an atheist professor or somebody who's like got a PhD in epistemology or something like that, like they might offer an angle that you haven't heard. Right. But usually, like, it's just always going to be the same types of arguments. So it can get monotonous in that way. But when it's like branching out into Islam, that's become more and more interesting to me as a topic.
Oh, sorry. What were we going to say?
No, I feel like I'm giving like too long of an answer to
No. I love it. I love this conversation because I consider myself a baby Christian and I'm still learning a lot and having these arguments or just conversations. I think they're very important. Where are you with the Shroud of Turin information that just came out? Is that something that comes up in debates, or do you believe?
So the school of apologetics that I come from is typically referred to as presuppositional, or what's called the transcendental argument for God. And so while we do think there's a place for evidences, because I study philosophy, I mainly focus on philosophical arguments. Mm-hmm. For one, because I tend to think that, again, there is a place for evidences, but like most people are going to interpret evidences according to their belief system. So it's like you could throw you could throw a million pieces of evidence in front of a committed atheist, and they're just going to interpret it according to their atheist presuppositions. So like, look, here's all this evidence for this guy rising from the dead. What's an atheist going to say? Okay, well, maybe something crazy happened one time in the past and science hasn't figured it out yet.
Right.
So, I mean, and the resurrection only has the meaning that it has in the Christian scheme for a Christian.
Right.
Like, it's not divorced from all the other things, right? Like the death of Christ and his incarnation, and the whole prophecies in the Old Testament of his coming. So it's a whole picture. And so I always focus on the philosophical argumentation for the holistic system versus the piecemeal argumentation about, well, what if I can prove to you that Jesus was laying on this cloth? And there's plenty of people that do that and are very good at evidential argumentation. It's just not the approach that I take because, number one, I don't find it the most convincing. And I think that philosophical argumentations are better. Mm-hmm. And that's just my domain.
Yeah, I found it interesting. I think it's a fascinating thing that they're talking about the Shroud of Turin and dating.